Welcome everyone. It's great that you're all here. This is part of a series of events organized by RS21, which is a socialist, feminist, and anti-racist group in Britain. Endgames is a series of monthly comradely conversations exploring crucial aspects of ecosocialism today. The introduction is in a society obsessed with ever-growing profit, what does it mean to move to a post-growth system? How does an alternative hedonism relate to liberation from capitalism and ecological breakdown? To start this discussion, we'll be joined by Kate Soper, who is the author of Post-Growth Living. Soper taught philosophy and cultural theory at the University of North London. Her previous works include On Human Needs, What is Nature, Culture, Politics, and the Non-Human, and Troubled Pleasures, and we're delighted that she's with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Kate to take it away. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Una, and thanks to everyone for sharing this opportunity to talk together. I'm going to focus primarily on the argument of my book and begin by suggesting that a great deal of commentary on climate change and environmental breakdown has been quite alarmist, understandably so in lots of ways, but mainly focused on environmental collapse and its consequences. And less attention has been directed, and I think this too really applies across the mainstream sort of left-right divide, to the role of human consumption and the ways it needs to change. And my book was an attempt to sort of correct this, to turn the spotlight around some damaged nature to the role of human production and consumption in its creation, and specifically that of growth-driven capitalism and its consumer culture. Today, of course, there is very widespread concern about ecological crisis, and it's across the whole of society now. And many have come to accept in a general way that we need to change our ways to guarantee long-term survival. But the issue is often discussed, as for example in the posturings recently of our Prime Minister in his speech to the UN, at a very abstract level that conceals the massive iniquities of a situation where 10% of the world's richest produce half of carbon emissions, while the poorest 3.5 billion account for just a tenth, where if that wealthiest 10% reduce their emissions to only the EU average, carbon emissions would fall by 35%. Where the 50 wealthiest Americans now control as much wealth as the 164 million poorest, and we're ending global poverty for the 21% of those living on less than $1.25 a day would cost just 0.2 of world income. And meanwhile, affluent governments, with the support largely of their electorates, remain committed to growth-driven capitalism as the solution to the crisis. They continue, that is, to insist that they can tackle the environmental problems via green growth measures that integrate with rather than transform the existing socio-economic order. We have to challenge that idea. We need to target the complacency and misinformation of mainstream politicians and the media in affluent societies in order to expose the truth about the specific role of capitalism and its colonial and neo-colonial appropriations in the creation of the crisis. And we need to challenge the extensive denial of the radical measures needed to address it. The scientists, to their credit, have of late been more explicit on the scale of the changes needed and the imperative of reduced production and consumption. They've also dashed the hopes on green growth to a significant degree. For example, in its 2019 report, decoupling debunked, the European Environmental Bureau made clear that although the project of decoupling continues to dominate international policy agendas, there is no empirical evidence, they say, supporting the existence of a decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressures on anywhere near the scale needed to deal with environmental breakdown. As George Monbiot put it in The Guardian recently, I quote him, "We have no hope of emerging from this full spectrum crisis unless we dramatically reduce economic activity. Wealth must be redistributed. A constrained world cannot afford the rich, but it must also be reduced. Sustaining our life support systems means doing less of almost everything." And I agree, but where I differ from Monbiot and others sounding the knell for the planet, if we continue as we are, where I differ is in seeing the crisis not so much simply as a disaster looming, but as an opportunity for breaking with ways of living, working, and consuming that are in many ways unpleasurable. And my argument for what I call alternative hedonism dwells on the enjoyments and benefits of adopting a less work-centered, high-speed, consumption-oriented way of living. I point to the ugly, puritanical, and self-denying aspects of the high-carbon lifestyle. For example, the time scarcity, stress, ill health, pollution and waste, the commercialization of children, the loss of community, and so on. And I argue that although climate change may threaten existing habits, it can also encourage us to envisage and adopt more environmentally benign and personally gratifying habits and practices. Alternative hedonism is premised, in fact, on the idea that even if the work and spend lifestyle were indefinitely sustainable, which of course it's not, it would not enhance human happiness and well-being beyond a certain point already reached by many in affluent societies. And its advocates believe that new forms of desire, rather than fears of ecological disaster, are more likely to encourage sustainable modes of consuming. I also, in defending this line, point to emerging signs of disaffection with the downsides of affluent living. In other words, to the evidence that is there in the expressions of public discontent with the stress and insecurity and wastage and so on of the high carbon lifestyle, and suggests that what we've got here is an incipient, imminent critique of consumer culture, which is going together with growing support for other greener and more pleasurable ways of living. And I claim that imminent critique as giving some legitimacy for my argument. I invoke here Raymond Williams's term of a structure of feeling. In other words, forms of latent disenchantment emerging that are not fully articulated, but can figure as a potential to which, arguments summoning a more an alternative way of living can hook into and respond to. I don't want to overstate this. Despite growing numbers of disaffected consumers, there is no way in which we can analyze environmental trouble as entirely accountable to the providing industries and their merchandising manipulations. I'm not very happy with it's all them, and who need to do things, and we don't have any kind of role in this. The appetites and priority given to convenience of many customers in the richer nations and the influence they exercise have a major role in environmental crisis, and any advocacy of transition to a fairer and greener economic order will need to recognize that. but by supplying a broader cultural dimension to the existing arguments and outlook of the political wing of anti-systemic forces, alternative hedonism can help to build a more diverse and substantial opposition to prevailing economic orthodoxy. It can also provide an overarching imaginary for the various initiatives seeking to bypass mainstream market provision via alternative networks for sharing and recycling and for exchanging goods, services, and expertise, including, for instance, the Buen Vivir movement, the New American Dream, and most recently in America, and possibly most ambitiously, at least for the US, the Next System Project. And there's many other groups that one could name here. In arguing for an alternative politics of prosperity, I am therefore challenging not only the approach of mainstream politics, but also those on the left who continue, as I've put it in the book, to naturalize the consumption and ways of living that have been fostered through capitalism. Too many on the left, while damning capitalist methods of production as a historical and by no means naturally determined mode of production, nonetheless tend to treat the lifestyle it's generated as if it were the only possible model of the good life, as the one to which less developed societies should aspire, and the one that socialists should seek to supply to all equally in a post-capitalist society. And in this respect, my alternative humanism aspirations are at odds with the futurist exuberance of technological utopianism and what's sometimes called luxury communism, and indeed at odds with the general resistance or on the Marxist left to rethink the attractions of material culture and the promises of abundance, and to press for new forms of both restraint and gratification. Unlike the tech utopians, I don't trust to a digital technology and automation to allow us to continue with the car culture and a more conventionally consumerist lifestyle. I argue for a more humanly oriented post-work order rather than a fully automated one. And I also follow one of the seminal thinkers in this area, namely André Gortz, in recognizing that we can't get rid of all unpleasant tasks, forms of work. But I argue that we could organize work culture in ways that meant people didn't spend all their time doing it. I argue, in fact, that people will want to go on working, provided it doesn't take over their entire lives and comes with more fulfillment and less stress. Hence my suggestion that we might reinstate some earlier ways of doing and making, enjoy, if you like, more hybrid ways of working. If we become less subject to the law of value, to having to make the maximum amount in the least possible time, we could make use of state-of-the-art technology in such key areas as energy provision or medicine, alongside allowing more return to more craft-based and artisanal methods of production in some other areas, allowing for more enriched ways of working and more attractive and durable goods. And this more complex vision of the potential satisfactions of work should, I argue, be reclaimed as an integral component of an avant-garde political imaginary, rather than dismissed as folk politics stuck in pre-modern social relations. Any moves towards that kind of reorganization of work would need funding in some form of citizens' income or UBI. And there are undeniably problems in providing funds for having more free time. but it would be a highly progressive move to confront and sort out those problems. Again, Gortz has it right here, I think. A UBI should not be thought of as a substitute for welfare payments, but as part of an institutional arrangement needed, as he put it, I quote, to wrest life away from the commercial imaginary and the total employment model. I also find the tech utopians unconvincing in what they claim about the ecologically benign resourcing of an internet-based economics of abundance. I think they are overly optimistic about the energy supply here. Artificial intelligence power consumption is expected to triple in the next 5 years. Emissions from information and communications technology are rising all the time, and they threaten to be equivalent to what the US emits currently by 2040. The mining, obviously, for the cobalt and the lithium needed for batteries is known already to be environmentally potentially disastrous. And then there's the problem of the e-waste, which promises to be even more mountainous and difficult to dispose of than it is at present, and does very little, I think, to do away with what has come to be known as salvage capitalism now. So I would argue that the tech utopian position is not only rather conventional and unimaginative in its ideas of abundance. You know, there's been talk about infinity pools for everyone, universal space tourism, a continuing car culture, albeit electric and driverless and so on, homes dominated by drones and gadgetry. But I think it's also nonchalant about how we supply the energy for it and how, in supplying it, we might wrest control from the high-tech giants. Little is said really about transition to that kind of scenario in that sense. So my own view is that those who have accepted the need for reconstruction of the Marxist message on proletarian agency should now also revise their utopian aspirations in order to acknowledge the obsolescence of those kinds of accelerationist visions. I think it's implausible to suppose that we can, either socially or environmentally, continue with current rates of economic expansion and consumption over the coming millennium, let alone in the more distant future. So the urgent need today, I would argue, is for a politics of prosperity that dissociates pleasure and fulfillment from resource-intensive consumption, from an endless accumulation of new machines and gadgetry, tourist space travel and the like, and thus avoids unworkable assumptions about what would constitute globally sustainable forms of industry and lifestyle. And in this context, I would argue that eco-socialists and Marxists must press for a debate on the good life and argue the need here in the UK, for example, for the Labour Party and trade unions to reframe their shorter-term economic goals and environmental policies in ways that allow them to be seen as consistent in the long term with a less growth-dependent way of thinking about the future of work, consumption, and human satisfaction. So I think, you know, we need, as it were, to build much more of a cultural revolution around an alternative politics of prosperity. One which obviously isn't arguing for degrowth tomorrow, but which would be pressing for a politics that saw its end in those terms, saw its ultimate transitional movement going in that direction. And this is not something that really is on the mainstream agenda at all. So the real problem, most immediate problem in terms of real politics at the moment, is that neither of the main political parties is conveying to the public the need to revolutionize methods of production and modes of consumption, and to begin to do it pretty quickly. They're not offering a serious counter to the dominant consumerist message on pleasure and well-being, nor making working less and enjoying more leisure time central to their appeal. Nor are they offering any sustained and well-publicized vision of the personal and social advantages of a post-consumerist way of living. Least of all are they talking openly to the public about the importance, if we're to secure ecological survival, even for the children of our own children, of bringing the era of capitalist growth economics and ever-expanding GDP to a close within the next few decades. Can affluent governments be made to change? Can the electoral vote in those societies be swung behind an alternative politics of prosperity? A politics that rejects what Serge Latouche has termed the imperial mode of being, rooted in colonialism and unlimited appropriation of resources, that instead embraces decommodification, the redistribution of wealth, a less acquisitive and work-centered existence, and, it should be said, a more enjoyable way of living. It seems very unlikely, but I believe it to be well nigh impossible while our mainstream parties remain so reactive, pandering always to a narrow and essentially market-defined set of existing interests and desires, rather than seeking to appeal to the lurking disaffections with consumer culture that I've highlighted in my argument on alternative hedonism. Here in the UK particularly, mainstream parties and the media dispute only the means to a shared set of ends: GDP growth, full employment, enhanced living standards, as defined by capitalist consumer culture, rather than seeking to question the ends themselves, or to give voice to any less consumerist ways of thinking. And that, I think, means that the main objective of any social movement campaigning for a new politics of prosperity has to be to bring effective party representation into existence and to consolidate that through alliances with other like-minded parties in other countries. A revision of thinking of the kind I'm advocating would, it is true, be convulsive at every level: social, cultural, and economic. It would demand commitments to an expansion of state governance and a significant reduction of economically and politically driven inequalities. It would require an essentially reproductive meeting of material needs for food, shelter, clothing, transport, communication, and recreation, rather than a form of provision reliant on constant technological innovation, fashion promotion, and a steady supply of new goods and services. It would need a transport system in which cars and planes have largely ceded to trains, buses, bikes, boats, and walking, and a way of living in which free time for most people would be considerably increased, could even exceed time spent in work, and allow participation in an environmentally sustainable but more extended range of intellectual and recreational activities than most people have previously been able to access or been accustomed to. And I think it would also, I mean, all this would involve a wholesale displacement of the advertising message and aesthetic, or certainly alternative messages that could contest that dominant aesthetic and the monopoly of advertising over the sense of the good life. There's no guarantee, of course, that anything like that will come about. If it does, It will, I suggest, follow the usual pattern of cultural change, in which what I've called aesthetic revisioning would play an important role. A new sense of self-interest would have to emerge, strongly influenced by environmental concern and discourse on sustainable consumption. And that, were those changes to take place, then they can involve dramatic revisionings of affective and emotional response, epiphanies, through which the attractions and repulsions of the world of material culture and lived experience undergo a kind of gestalt switch. I've compared this to some of the changes that were wrought through feminism, for example. Persons or objects or behaviors or practices that were formerly erotically seductive or aesthetically compelling yield their enchantment to others that previously held little of those attractions. And integral to that kind of shift would be an aesthetic suspension and reordering of feeling as commodities and services and forms of life, once perceived as enticingly glamorous, come gradually to be seen instead as cumbersome, ugly, and retrograde, thanks to their association with unsustainable resource use, noise, toxicity, or their legacy of unrecyclable waste. Advertisers, in a sense, have been aware of this kind of shift, and are very canny at responding to shifting regimes of truth and belief. I mean, for example, no one today could market an anti-green fly spray with the image used in the 1950s of a mother and father and child all wreathing themselves in clouds of pesticide as they get rid of the green fly on the rosebush. Until they were finally banned, the imagery of cigarette advertisements was rarely connected with the act of smoking. Car advertisement still almost always relies on an implausible depiction of the vehicle as a kind of solitary in nature. So, I mean, I'm saying that, you know, we need to actually be able to create in some way a cultural revolutionary new imagery, which actually, you know, draws on that kind of notion of the connection between belief systems and aesthetic responses, in order to build up more of an aesthetic revisioning around environmentally damaging goods. But let me just say in conclusion here that I don't think is an anti-consumerist ethic and aesthetic should dwell exclusively on the ecological necessity of revised ideas of pleasure and the good life, but also on their hedonist potential. And it needs to challenge the idea that there is something inherently totalitarian about attempts to control our consumption. Calls to curb consumption are still routinely rejected by liberal defendants of the market as authoritarian, even as the market itself commands us to marginalize whatever is not commercially viable, condemns us to long hours of often very boring work, to provide stuff that isn't really needed, monopolizes conceptions of pleasure, and grooms our children for lifetimes of consumption. There are, if you like, totalitarian tendencies here that we need to highlight. Market-driven consumption should now be seen for what it has arguably largely become, namely a means of further extending the global reach and command of corporate power at the expense of the health and well-being of both the planet and the majority of its inhabitants. So the commitment to an alternative politics of prosperity based on a sustainable economic order needs to be seen in this context as a continuation of the emancipatory project. If we have a cosmopolitan care for the well-being of the more deprived people of the world, and a concern about the quality of life of future generations, then we have to campaign for dramatic changes of the attitudes to work, consumption, and self-realization in the more affluent communities. That revolution in feeling would, I think, be comparable in the forms of social transformation and personal change it will demand to those brought about through the feminist, anti-racist and anti-colonialist movements of recent times. I'll stop there, okay?
Thank you very much.